A little beggar girl shouted to a millionaire, "Help me, Dad, I'm hungry." When the millionaire saw the mark on the girl's neck, he was shocked and started to cry. What happened next is even more shocking. Leave your like to keep following upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more incredible stories like this one. Arthur was walking through the square with his hands in his pockets, head down, as he often did when he needed to disconnect from his routine world. He was a successful man, owner of several companies, and recognized for his impeccable work ethic. But deep down, he felt an emptiness that money couldn't fill. Around him, the bustle of the city contrasted with the silence that lived within him. Children's laughter on the swings, the aroma of coffee from a small nearby kiosk, and the murmur of conversation seemed so distant, as if they were happening on another plane. For Arthur, that walk was just a way to try to fill his time, although each step he took felt heavier than the last. Suddenly, a childlike, sharp, desperate voice stopped him in his tracks. "Help me, Dad, I'm hungry." Arthur turned his head, looking for who had spoken. A few meters away, he saw a small girl. She was dirty, wearing worn and patched clothes that barely seemed to keep her warm. Her large, dark eyes were fixed on him, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. For a moment, he thought it might be some trick, perhaps a tactic to move passers-by and get some money from them. However, there was something in her voice that struck him differently, as if those words had been directed specifically at him. He approached slowly, trying not to seem threatening. As he moved closer, he began to notice details that unsettled him. The girl seemed far too thin, with sunken cheeks and small hands that could barely close her tattered coat. Arthur, who had learned to be reserved with his emotions, felt an inexplicable sense of unease begin to invade him. "What did you say?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her, trying not to show the confusion he felt. "Help me, Dad," the girl repeated in a lower but just as firm voice. Arthur frowned, trying to make sense of what was happening. Perhaps the girl had mistaken him for someone else, or maybe she was just desperate and said the first thing that came to mind. But then, with another step closer, he saw a small mark on the girl's neck, just below her right ear. It was identical to the birthmark he himself had, which he'd inherited from his mother, a small, crescent-shaped stain. His mind started spinning, searching for logical explanations, but none seemed reasonable. The mark was too specific, too personal. Arthur felt a chill run down his back. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "Helen," the girl answered. Her name echoed in Arthur's mind, though he couldn't recall from where. "Where's your mother?" he insisted, his heart beating faster. Helen lowered her gaze, as though the question had saddened her. "My mom's been gone for a long time. I'm here with the others," she said, indicating with a slight tilt of her head a group of children playing near an older woman who was watching over them. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. How was it possible that a girl on the street had that mark? Why did he feel this immediate connection with her? His world, usually so controlled and calculated, began to wobble at a speed that left him breathless. "Who brought you here, Helen?" he asked gently, while she observed him with curiosity. "I've always been here," the girl replied with a shrug, as if it needed no further explanation. Arthur felt a surge of emotion overwhelm him. It couldn't be a coincidence. Something inside him told him that this girl had to be connected to him in some way. His mind desperately sought answers, but questions piled up faster than he could process them. Finally, Arthur knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. "Helen, I'm going to help you, but I need to know more about you," he said in as firm a voice as he could manage, although he was full of doubts inside. The girl nodded slightly, and a hint of hope lit her eyes. Arthur, for the first time in years, felt that his life had taken a turn he couldn't control, but also one he couldn't ignore. And although he still had no idea who Helen was or why he felt such a strong bond with her, he knew at that moment his life was about to change forever. Arthur remained silent, his mind still processing Helen's words, when a female figure slowly approached. It was an older woman of simple appearance, her gray hair tied in a bun, wearing a worn shawl that barely protected her shoulders from the cool breeze. She had a tired expression, but her eyes conveyed an unusual warmth. Known in the square as Miss Lucy, she looked first at Helen and then at Arthur, as if assessing the situation before speaking. "Everything all right, my girl?" she asked softly, resting a hand on Helen's shoulder. Helen nodded slightly, but her eyes never left Arthur, who was still kneeling, trying to understand what was happening. "Are you the father?" Miss Lucy asked curiously, though without accusing him. Arthur stood up slowly, feeling that question strike him like a blow. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, his own words sounding unsteady to him. "She called me and said things that don't make sense." He stopped, looking at the girl as if searching for answers she couldn't give him. Miss Lucy sighed and nodded, as if she understood more than she showed. "This is Helen. She's been here since she was left at an old house when she was just a baby. She grew up with us, people who take care of those who have no one." Her tone was neutral, but there was a hidden sadness in it, as if carrying so many stories had become part of her life. "Who left her there? Where's her family?" Arthur demanded, unable to control the urgency in his voice. "That's a mystery that was never solved," Miss Lucy replied, looking at Helen tenderly. "She appeared one night, wrapped in a blanket in front of an abandoned house, on the other side of the park. Some children found her crying and brought her to me. Since then, we've done what we can." Helen remained silent, but her hand clung tightly to Miss Lucy's, as though the story stirred up memories she couldn't express. Arthur felt a weight on his chest, as if each word the older woman spoke added a burden he didn't know how to carry. "And her mother?" he asked after a moment, hoping for some thread that might guide him. Helen lifted her eyes to him. "My mom's gone. She's been gone a long time. Miss Lucy always tells me she's in a nice place, but I don't remember her voice." Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of sadness that resonated with Arthur. A little beggar girl shouted to a millionaire, "Help me, Dad, I'm hungry." When the millionaire saw the mark on the girl's neck, he was shocked and started to cry. What happened next is even more shocking. Leave your like to keep following upcoming videos, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more incredible stories like this one. Arthur was walking through the square with his hands in his pockets, head down, as he often did when he needed to disconnect from his routine world. He was a successful man, owner of several companies, and recognized for his impeccable work ethic. But deep down, he felt an emptiness that money couldn't fill. Around him, the bustle of the city contrasted with the silence that lived within him. Children's laughter on the swings, the aroma of coffee from a small nearby kiosk, and the murmur of conversation seemed so distant, as if they were happening on another plane. For Arthur, that walk was just a way to try to fill his time, although each step he took felt heavier than the last. Suddenly, a childlike, sharp, desperate voice stopped him in his tracks. "Help me, Dad, I'm hungry." Arthur turned his head, looking for who had spoken. A few meters away, he saw a small girl. She was dirty, wearing worn and patched clothes that barely seemed to keep her warm. Her large, dark eyes were fixed on him, filled with a mixture of fear and hope. For a moment, he thought it might be some trick, perhaps a tactic to move passers-by and get some money from them. However, there was something in her voice that struck him differently, as if those words had been directed specifically at him. He approached slowly, trying not to seem threatening. As he moved closer, he began to notice details that unsettled him. The girl seemed far too thin, with sunken cheeks and small hands that could barely close her tattered coat. Arthur, who had learned to be reserved with his emotions, felt an inexplicable sense of unease begin to invade him. "What did you say?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her, trying not to show the confusion he felt. "Help me, Dad," the girl repeated in a lower but just as firm voice. Arthur frowned, trying to make sense of what was happening. Perhaps the girl had mistaken him for someone else, or maybe she was just desperate and said the first thing that came to mind. But then, with another step closer, he saw a small mark on the girl's neck, just below her right ear. It was identical to the birthmark he himself had, which he'd inherited from his mother, a small, crescent-shaped stain. His mind started spinning, searching for logical explanations, but none seemed reasonable. The mark was too specific, too personal. Arthur felt a chill run down his back. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "Helen," the girl answered. Her name echoed in Arthur's mind, though he couldn't recall from where. "Where's your mother?" he insisted, his heart beating faster. Helen lowered her gaze, as though the question had saddened her. "My mom's been gone for a long time. I'm here with the others," she said, indicating with a slight tilt of her head a group of children playing near an older woman who was watching over them. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. How was it possible that a girl on the street had that mark? Why did he feel this immediate connection with her? His world, usually so controlled and calculated, began to wobble at a speed that left him breathless. "Who brought you here, Helen?" he asked gently, while she observed him with curiosity. "I've always been here," the girl replied with a shrug, as if it needed no further explanation. Arthur felt a surge of emotion overwhelm him. It couldn't be a coincidence. Something inside him told him that this girl had to be connected to him in some way. His mind desperately sought answers, but questions piled up faster than he could process them. Finally, Arthur knelt in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level. "Helen, I'm going to help you, but I need to know more about you," he said in as firm a voice as he could manage, although he was full of doubts inside. The girl nodded slightly, and a hint of hope lit her eyes. Arthur, for the first time in years, felt that his life had taken a turn he couldn't control, but also one he couldn't ignore. And although he still had no idea who Helen was or why he felt such a strong bond with her, he knew at that moment his life was about to change forever. Arthur remained silent, his mind still processing Helen's words, when a female figure slowly approached. It was an older woman of simple appearance, her gray hair tied in a bun, wearing a worn shawl that barely protected her shoulders from the cool breeze. She had a tired expression, but her eyes conveyed an unusual warmth. Known in the square as Miss Lucy, she looked first at Helen and then at Arthur, as if assessing the situation before speaking. "Everything all right, my girl?" she asked softly, resting a hand on Helen's shoulder. Helen nodded slightly, but her eyes never left Arthur, who was still kneeling, trying to understand what was happening. "Are you the father?" Miss Lucy asked curiously, though without accusing him. Arthur stood up slowly, feeling that question strike him like a blow. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, his own words sounding unsteady to him. "She called me and said things that don't make sense." He stopped, looking at the girl as if searching for answers she couldn't give him. Miss Lucy sighed and nodded, as if she understood more than she showed. "This is Helen. She's been here since she was left at an old house when she was just a baby. She grew up with us, people who take care of those who have no one." Her tone was neutral, but there was a hidden sadness in it, as if carrying so many stories had become part of her life. "Who left her there? Where's her family?" Arthur demanded, unable to control the urgency in his voice. "That's a mystery that was never solved," Miss Lucy replied, looking at Helen tenderly. "She appeared one night, wrapped in a blanket in front of an abandoned house, on the other side of the park. Some children found her crying and brought her to me. Since then, we've done what we can." Helen remained silent, but her hand clung tightly to Miss Lucy's, as though the story stirred up memories she couldn't express. Arthur felt a weight on his chest, as if each word the older woman spoke added a burden he didn't know how to carry. "And her mother?" he asked after a moment, hoping for some thread that might guide him. Helen lifted her eyes to him. "My mom's gone. She's been gone a long time. Miss Lucy always tells me she's in a nice place, but I don't remember her voice." Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of sadness that resonated with Arthur. "Why do you always get so uncomfortable talking about children?" he asked directly. Claire looked at him in disbelief. "What are you implying?" "I just don't see the need to complicate our lives over something meaningless. That doesn't prove anything." Arthur took a step closer, eyes fixed on his wife. "You're not telling me everything, are you? Something else is going on. I can feel it." "Of course there's nothing else," Claire answered, raising her voice, a rare thing for her. "That girl has nothing to do with you or me. What are you hoping to find, Arthur? Some magical story that explains it all? Sometimes things have no explanation." Silence fell, thick with tension. Claire held his gaze, as though daring him to keep prying into something she didn't want discovered. "I'm going to investigate," he finally said, breaking the stillness. "I need to know who that girl is and why she came to me. No matter how much you try to dissuade me, I can't ignore what I felt." Claire shook her head, dropping onto the couch once more. "Do whatever you want, Arthur, but don't expect me to get caught up in something so ridiculous." Arthur walked out, his mind swirling with more questions. As he climbed the stairs to his study, he reflected on how Claire had tried so hard to change the subject, as though she were hiding something. That suspicion only fueled his determination to dig for the truth. Locked in his study, Arthur mentally replayed the day's events, every detail, every word from Helen, every gesture from Claire. He knew he couldn't let his doubts paralyze him. Something bigger was at stake, something he still couldn't see clearly but was determined to uncover. He also realized he couldn't do this alone. Trying to piece together the puzzle in his mind, especially when he thought of Helen's mark and Claire's evasiveness, left him going in circles. He needed help, someone who could search thoroughly and find solid answers. After a sleepless night, he decided to hire Michael, a private detective with a reputation for resolving delicate, complicated cases. He had met Michael at a business event years back. Though discreet, Michael's knack for reading between the lines and digging up hidden truths was unforgettable. Arthur called him early in the morning. Michael answered right away and was at the mansion within an hour, sitting across from him in the study. "This case seems unusual," Michael said, reviewing the few notes Arthur had taken. "A street girl who mentions your name, a connection you can't explain, and the mark on her neck." He paused, eyeing Arthur curiously. "That's pretty specific. It's not common for such a thing to be a mere coincidence." "That's why I need you on it," Arthur said, his voice tense. "I can't stop thinking about it. And Claire, I don't know. There's something in her behavior that makes me suspect she knows more than she admits." Arthur felt restless and made no effort to hide it. Michael nodded. "All right, I'll start with the basics. Check out the girl's story. I'll talk to Ms. Lucy, the woman who looks after her, and see if there are any records or someone else who can tell me more. But, Arthur, know this, in cases like this, the truth may not be what we're expecting." "Whatever it is, I have to know," Arthur answered, resolute. "I can't live like this, with so many questions." Michael stood, storing the papers in a folder. "I'll keep you informed, but you need patience. These investigations don't always advance quickly." Arthur watched him leave the study. Though he felt he'd made the right call, it didn't lessen his anxiety. He had set something in motion that might change everything, but he had no idea where it would lead. Michael's first step was to investigate the spot where Miss Lucy claimed Helen was found, an old, abandoned house, boarded windows and partially collapsed roof. He asked neighbors about a child left there. Few recalled anything. One older woman vaguely remembered seeing a car parked outside the house late one night, but no details beyond that. Michael diligently jotted down every fragment of information, knowing that even the smallest detail could be crucial. Next, he headed to the square where Arthur had first encountered Helen. There, he found Miss Lucy surrounded by children. She was wary of him at first, but once he explained that he was investigating on Arthur's behalf, her expression softened. "I just want to help Helen," Michael said in a calm but persuasive tone. "If there's anything about her past you can share, anything, you'd be helping a lot." Miss Lucy studied him for a moment before nodding. "Helen got here as a baby. Nobody knew who left her or why. I found her wrapped in a blanket, not more than a few months old. There was no note, nothing to explain where she came from, just the blanket and a tiny bracelet with her name embroidered." "Do you still have the blanket or the bracelet?" he asked. "Of course. I saved them. I don't know why, but I felt one day they'd be important." Miss Lucy went away briefly and came back with a cloth bag. Inside, Michael found a well-worn but clean blanket and a small cloth bracelet embroidered in blue with the name Helen. He looked them over carefully and noticed that the blanket had a symbol in one corner that he didn't recognize. "Has anyone ever come asking after Helen?" he asked as he handed the items back. "A man came years ago, when she was about 3, Miss Lucy replied. He never said who he was or why he wanted to know. Looked nervous, and after I told him I didn't know much, he left and never returned." Michael made a note of the man's vague description, assured her he'd keep her in the loop if he learned anything, and departed with the blanket and bracelet as the first tangible clues. Back in his office, Michael started analyzing the blanket's embroidery. After hours of research, he discovered that the symbol came from a luxury textile company, now defunct for over a decade. It was a small detail, but enough to suggest the blanket was no ordinary item. He decided to track down the client list of the old company, a tedious job that finally led to a surprising find. Claire had been a frequent customer before the company closed. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it hinted at a link between her and Helen. Michael immediately contacted Arthur with the news. "Arthur, I might have something important," he said, voice neutral. "Go on," Arthur replied. "The blanket that Helen was wrapped in came from a textile company that no longer exists. Reviewing its records, I found Claire was a client." Arthur was silent a moment. "So you're saying Claire might be involved?" "I'm not drawing conclusions yet, but it's a coincidence we can't ignore. I'll keep investigating, but be ready for anything that comes out." Arthur felt anger and fear rise within him. He didn't want to believe that Claire could be involved, but her recent behavior, and now this discovery, made it hard to dismiss. Michael pressed on, digging into Claire's past while Arthur anxiously awaited updates. The possibility that his wife might be connected to Helen's abandonment frightened him, but also drove him to find the truth, even if it could shatter everything he'd built. Michael spent days tracking down Gustav, the old chauffeur who had worked for Arthur and Claire years earlier. His name had come up in the employee records, but locating him proved difficult. Finally, following various leads, Michael found him in a small town on the outskirts, employed in a mechanic's shop, a job well beneath the standard of living he'd once had. Michael observed Gustav from his car for a while before approaching. The middle-aged man looked tired and run down, like someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. Michael entered the shop quietly and waited for Gustav to finish with a customer. "Gustav Torres, right?" he asked in a no-nonsense tone. Gustav turned slowly, wrench in hand, and eyed him warily. "Who's asking?" he said, wiping his hands with a rag. "My name's Michael. I'm a private investigator. I'm here about something related to your old job with Arthur and Claire." Gustav visibly tensed, though he tried to hide it. "I don't know how I can help you. I quit that job years ago, I've got nothing to do with them now." Michael gave a slight smile, like he'd expected that answer. "I'm not here to cause trouble, but if you know something, it's best we talk now. This is about something serious, a girl." Gustav set the rag down and walked to the workshop door, closing it to keep others out. He pointed to a makeshift office in the corner. "Let's talk in there." In that office, Michael got straight to the point. "I know you worked for Arthur and Claire for years. I also know something happened, something about a baby. I need you to tell me what you know." Gustav sighed, sinking into a worn chair. I don't know what you've heard, but I was just doing my job. I didn't realize what I was getting into. Explain, Michael insisted calmly, not looking away. Gustav lowered his gaze as if the words were too heavy to bear. Eventually, he spoke. Claire came to me one day, a long time ago. She was nervous, but tried to look calm. She asked a favor, one I had to keep secret from everyone. She told me to drive something to a deserted place, no questions asked. What was that something? Michael asked. A baby. Gustav paused, clearly ashamed. I had no idea whose child it was, knew nothing. Claire just said to do it, that she'd pay me well. I didn't want trouble, so I agreed. Michael studied him intently. Where did you take the baby? An abandoned house near the square. No one ever went there. She told me to leave the baby and make sure nobody saw me. I did it, but back in the car, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was a baby, for God's sake. I knew it was wrong. What did you do afterward? Michael pressed. I kept the stuff Claire gave me, the blanket, some baby clothes. Don't ask me why. Maybe it was guilt. I couldn't just leave it all behind, but I couldn't confront Claire, she was powerful, and I didn't want trouble. You still have those things? Michael recognized that they could be crucial evidence. Gustav nodded shakily. In a box. Haven't opened it in years. But they're there. I need to see them, Michael said firmly. It's important. Gustav went to a messy shelf and pulled out a dusty cardboard box, placing it on the table. Opening it, Michael saw a small blanket with tattered edges, and a baby garment embroidered carefully with the name Helen. Anything else you know about the baby? Michael asked, examining them. Did Claire ever tell you why she did this? No, Gustav admitted with a shake of his head. She never mentioned it again. Paid me well and made sure I'd forget. But I never stopped wondering what became of that girl. Michael carefully placed the items in his briefcase. What happened to her is finally coming to light. But this is bigger than you realize, Gustav. That same evening, Michael went to Arthur's mansion. Arthur received him, and the detective showed him the objects. Arthur's hands trembled when he recognized the embroidery on the blanket. It matched the defunct textile company that linked Claire to the child, but now that these physical items were in front of him, it all felt uncomfortably real. Who did this? Arthur asked, voice tight. Gustav, your former driver. Claire paid him to abandon the girl. He doesn't know why, but he felt something was off and saved these out of guilt. Now we know the child is Helen. Arthur sank into an armchair, burying his face in his hands. Claire's betrayal ran deeper than he'd ever imagined. She hadn't just hidden her actions, she'd affected the life of a child who was, without a doubt, his daughter. What else does Gustav know? Arthur asked without looking up. Very little, but enough to confirm Claire's involvement. The question is what you plan to do about it. Arthur exhaled, staring again at the items. He realized the road ahead wouldn't be simple, but he also knew he couldn't ignore the facts. His life was about to change forever. He spent that night staring at the baby garments and blanket, unable to sleep. They were tangible proof of something he'd considered only a mystery. Now it had a name, Helen, and a culprit, Claire, the woman he'd shared years of his life with, the woman who was his wife. She hadn't just lied, she'd done something so grave, it shattered his entire perception of their marriage. Dawn found Arthur in the main living room, waiting for Claire, tension thick in the air. She came down calmly, not noticing how serious his face was until he spoke. We need to talk, he said, stopping her before she could greet him. Claire, startled at his tone, looked at him curiously. What's wrong? You look worried. Arthur pointed to the table, where the blanket and baby garment lay embroidered with Helen's name. Claire paused, and for an instant her face changed, enough to confirm Arthur's suspicions. Why do you have that? She asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice trembled slightly. I should be the one asking questions, Claire, Arthur replied, his voice colder than she'd ever heard. Do you want to tell me what's going on, or should I? Claire folded her arms defensively. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Arthur said, raising his voice. You know perfectly well. Gustav told me everything. He told me how you paid him to abandon a child who had every right to be here, with her father. Claire's face hardened. She seemed on the verge of denying everything, but then let out a long sigh and settled onto the sofa. Fine, she said, sounding both tired and resigned. Yes, I did it. And what of it? I did it for us, Arthur. For our future. Arthur, anger boiling, stood up. For us. Leaving a defenseless child in the street was for us. That girl is my daughter, Claire. How could you do such a cruel thing? Claire glared, voice rising. She wasn't my daughter, Arthur, she was your problem, your mistake. I didn't want that burden, and I didn't want her destroying what we'd built. My mistake? Arthur repeated, incredulous. Helen isn't a mistake, she's a child, my child. How could you even conceive of doing this? How could you decide it all behind my back? Because I knew how you'd react, Claire retorted coldly. You're too sentimental, Arthur, you always have been. If I told you, you'd insist on bringing her here, giving her a place in our life, and that wasn't an option after everything I had planned for us. Arthur looked at her as if seeing a stranger. Each word drove them further apart. Planned for us, he muttered. So all these years were just a scheme for you? None of it meant anything? She hesitated but did not soften. Arthur, you can't deny that we lived comfortably. Stable. I did what I had to do to protect that. Protect what, Claire? A lie, he said, dropping back into his chair, passing his hands over his face. I can't believe you did this, abandoning a little girl just to keep your comforts. That's enough, Arthur, Claire said, standing up. I didn't come to justify anything. I did what I believed was necessary. If you want to destroy everything we have because of the past, that's on you. Arthur lifted his eyes to her. At that moment, he made a decision. You're right, Claire. This is my decision, and I've made it. I can't stay with you. I can't look at you without seeing what you've done. We're finished. Claire stared, incredulous. You'd end this over that? After all we've been through? Yes, Arthur replied calmly, surprising himself. Because all we've been through means nothing after what I've found out, and I won't keep living a lie. Claire was silent, as though searching for some words to save the situation, but at last she walked out. Arthur was left alone, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He'd made a decision that would forever alter his life, but he was sure it was right. Now he had to focus on Helen, on giving her the life from which she'd been robbed, and on fixing the damage inflicted without his knowledge. That same afternoon, he called Michael and explained. I want to bring Helen here, he said, resolute. She needs to be with me. I don't know how, but I'll find a way. Michael, pragmatic as ever, replied, Arthur, this won't be easy. Helen's lived in a completely different world, and bringing her into yours won't happen overnight. There will be obstacles, but if you're sure, we'll make it work. Arthur knew he was right but refused to back down. Helen was his daughter, and now that he knew the truth, he would do anything to be with her. Though the challenges had barely begun, he was prepared to overcome them, believing he could build a better life for both. Michael was convinced Miss Lucy knew more than she let on. Her careful manner of speaking, the deliberate pauses, and the details she skipped indicated she was concealing something. He decided to dig into her past. Not an easy job, but he had resources to reconstruct the life of an apparently simple woman. First discovery, Miss Lucy had worked as a nurse for decades before retiring. She dedicated her life to caring for others, but around 15 years ago, something made her quit abruptly. Former colleagues said that after the incident, she vanished from formal employment, devoting herself to community care, working with street children. Michael wondered if that abrupt change was connected to Helen. The timelines matched too well to ignore. He hunted down Miss Lucy's old co-workers and managed to find a woman named Martha, who had worked alongside her for years. They met in a modest cafe, and Michael dove right in. "I'm looking into a woman named Lucy, a former nurse who now cares for homeless children. You worked with her, and I need to know more about her life." Martha nodded slowly, as if carefully recalling. Lucy was an excellent nurse, always devoted, and truly concerned for her patients. Then suddenly she resigned and disappeared, no explanation. Did she ever mention an incident, something that might have caused her to leave so drastically? Michael asked, mentally recording every word. "I remember one particular case. I'm not sure it's relevant, but it was odd. She attended a woman who gave birth under delicate conditions. The woman was very nervous and always accompanied by someone who monitored Lucy's every move. Soon after, Lucy left the hospital and never spoke of it again." Michael sensed he was close. He decided to question Miss Lucy directly. Returning to the square, he observed her quietly while she minded the children. Upon seeing him approach, her face showed resignation and determination. She knew he was after answers, and knew he wouldn't leave otherwise. "We need to talk, Miss Lucy." "Not here, somewhere private," he said calmly but firmly. She nodded after a moment and led him to her small house in a modest neighborhood a few blocks away. Sitting in her living room, amid old photos and sparse decorations, Michael lost no time in outlining what he'd found. "I know you were a nurse. I know you left after a particular case, and I know that case is linked to Helen," he said, watching her closely. Lucy sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. "I always knew this day would come, but never thought it would be like this." "Please tell me everything you know," Michael urged her. Lucy took a small sip of water before starting. Helen was born in complicated circumstances. Her mother was young, frightened, and under the thumb of someone who manipulated her. That person was Claire. She controlled the entire situation from the start, obsessed with ensuring that child didn't exist in her life. "How did you get involved?" Michael asked, moving closer. "I was the nurse assisting the birth. Right away, I saw something wasn't right. The mother had no freedom, everything she did or said was supervised. Claire was there, making sure no one else discovered the baby. Once Helen was born, Claire ordered her taken away. They paid me to keep quiet, but I couldn't watch it happen and do nothing. I knew I had to act." "What did you do then?" Michael asked, riveted. "I kept the baby hidden for a time. Considered giving her up to the authorities, but Claire was powerful, with the means to find her. I didn't want Helen falling into the wrong hands. So I took care of her myself until it was safe to entrust her to someone who could protect her." "Why not speak up sooner? Why let her grow up without knowing the truth?" Michael pressed. Lucy looked sad. "Claire threatened me. She knew I was involved, made it clear that if I tried anything, the people closest to me would suffer. I had no choice. I stayed silent, but I always looked out for Helen from a distance, doing what I could with what I had. Would you be willing to explain all this to Arthur now?" "He has to know," Michael insisted. "Yes," Lucy said after a pause. "It's time the whole truth came out." That evening, Michael brought Lucy to Arthur's mansion. She told him everything: Helen's birth, Claire's threats, the hush money. Each word confirmed Arthur's suspicions, but also revealed a sprawling web of lies and manipulations more complex than he'd imagined. Arthur listened in silence, eyes reflecting both sorrow and determination. He couldn't change the past, but he knew he had to set things right, not just for Helen but for all the other lives Claire's decisions had hurt. Arthur had vowed he'd do whatever it took to form a bond with Helen. After hearing Lucy's account, he grasped how many years he'd lost with his daughter, and also how Helen had been denied the love and stability she deserved. But he realized it wouldn't be simple. Helen grew up in a world where distrust was survival, so gaining her trust would take time. On her first visit to the mansion, Helen's big, curious eyes took everything in with a mix of fascination and caution. Arthur tried to keep things warm, low-key, but inside he was nervous, determined not to put a foot wrong. He showed her around, not to show off, but to help her feel welcome. "This place is huge," Helen said, looking down one of the corridors. "I know," Arthur answered with a small smile. "Sometimes it's too big for just one person, which is why I'm happy you're here." Helen said nothing, but her gaze softened, as though his words reached something inside. Over the following days, Arthur sought ways to spend time with her. Drawing together, playing with toys he'd bought just for her, Helen, though still reserved, began revealing flashes of real happiness. Each time Arthur made her laugh or smile, he felt triumphant. One afternoon in the garden, Helen settled beneath a tree and suddenly spoke, a rare event for her. "Miss Lucy told me trees can keep secrets." "Do you think that's true?" she asked, watching the branches overhead. Arthur sat next to her. "Not sure. But there's something special about them. Maybe they don't keep secrets, but I think they listen." Helen eyed him carefully. "Do you have secrets?" The question caught him off guard. He knew Helen was more observant than she looked. After a moment, he answered honestly, "Yes, but I'm learning not to hide the important ones. I want you to know everything, if you're ready to hear it." She didn't speak immediately, but her expression showed that she appreciated his frankness. A small but significant step forward. In time, they talked more deeply. Arthur told her stories from his own childhood, recalling how his mother always said the mark on his neck was special, proof he was meant for bigger things. Hearing that, Helen touched her own birthmark, thoughtful. "So I'm special too?" she asked softly. "You're more special than you imagine," he said, swallowing a lump in his throat. Yet it wasn't all smooth. Helen still had questions Arthur didn't know how to answer. One night, as he read her a story before bed, she broke in. "Why didn't my mom want me?" she asked, eyes mixing sadness and curiosity. Arthur felt a weight on his chest. He couldn't offer a neat, simple explanation, because the reality was complex and hurtful. After a moment, he replied, "Your mom was scared. She made mistakes, but that doesn't mean it was your fault. You're wonderful, and nothing that happened was because of you." Helen gave him a long look, seeming to consider his words, then lay back down. He stayed by her until she fell asleep, pondering how much hurt could be packed into such a short life. Another afternoon, strolling through a park, Helen stopped and gazed at a bench where other children played. Arthur saw longing in her face. "Want to join them?" he asked, hoping she'd say yes. She shook her head. "I don't think they'd want me. They never do." Arthur bent down to her level. "That's not true. Sometimes you just need to take the first step. Want me to go with you?" Helen glanced uncertain but nodded. He walked her over, and soon they were playing happily. Helen's laughter rang out, showing a side of her Arthur had never seen. That night at dinner, Helen surprised him with a question. "Will you always be here?" she asked, staring at her plate like she was afraid of the answer. Arthur placed his fork down, leaning in. "Always, Helen. No matter what happens, I'll be here for you." She looked at him, letting a tear slip down her cheek for the first time. Arthur said no more, simply hugging her while she realized she wasn't alone. As the weeks went by, Helen's trust in Arthur grew. But each step forward could trigger setbacks, memories or reminders of her old life. Arthur, though, was dead set on patience, determined to prove that no matter how long it took, he wasn't leaving. Helen opened up about her early experiences, describing the hardships of finding food or shelter before she met Miss Lucy. Each story cut Arthur deeply, but also strengthened his resolve to give her the life she deserved. One night, as they viewed an album of photos he had compiled, Helen pointed to one of him as a child. "You look happy," she said, almost wistful. "I was," Arthur replied. "And I want you to be happy too." She returned a tiny smile, and he felt they were on the right track. Rebuilding their relationship wouldn't be easy, but every small victory made it worthwhile. Meanwhile, Michael worked tirelessly to close any gaps in Helen's story and how it tied to Arthur. Though progress was good, Michael sensed something else at play, a missing piece that explained why events had been so fraught. Then he noticed a clue. While reviewing Gustav's bank records, he saw suspicious transactions, money that clashed with the modest lifestyle Gustav led. Intrigued, Michael dug deeper. A financial analyst friend confirmed that Gustav had received transfers from a shell company belonging to Mark Verger, a known rival of Arthur's. It was surprising but not enough to explain everything. Michael still needed Gustav to clarify. Confronting Gustav a second time, Michael found him at the same workshop. Gustav dropped a tool on seeing him enter, eyes anxious. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he said, forcing a laugh. "I didn't expect to see all that money in your accounts," Michael said curtly. "Why is Mark Verger paying you?" "Think before you lie, I already know the truth." Gustav paled, stepping backward. "It's not how it looks. I was protecting myself." "Protecting yourself from Arthur, or the people you betrayed?" Michael didn't raise his voice, but the tone made it clear no excuses would do. The man swallowed and collapsed into a chair. "All right, I'll tell you. But don't think it was easy. Verger showed up a few years back. He knew about Helen, everything. Offered me money for intel on Arthur. I was desperate, broke. I couldn't refuse." "What kind of intel?" Michael asked, leaning forward. "Anything to use against him, personal details, business deals, even stuff about Claire. Now he's using Helen's story to bury Arthur, said if it came out, it'd wreck his reputation." Michael listened silently, letting it sink in. This was not mere betrayal, it was a calculated assault. A meticulously planned vendetta by someone with everything to gain if Arthur fell. "And what did you get out of it?" Michael finally asked. "Money," Gustav replied bluntly, "plus a promise my name would stay clean if everything went sour." Michael stared with both contempt and pity. "What makes you think Mark won't make you the scapegoat when he's done with you?" Gustav didn't answer. Guilt and fear showed plainly on his face. "You're going to fix this," Michael declared. "You'll spill everything about Mark and his plans, then you're going to Arthur to explain what you've done. That's your only chance at decency." Gustav nodded slowly, knowing it was his sole way out. Over the next hours, Michael took careful notes on everything Gustav recalled. Mark had prepared his strike meticulously, waiting years, gathering info. He planned not just to ruin Arthur publicly but to snap up his companies at dirt-cheap prices. Michael brought his findings to Arthur that very evening. Listening calmly, Arthur felt as if the floor were caving in, but he stayed composed. "I knew I had enemies in business," he said finally, voice boiling with anger, "but never expected them to use my daughter to do it." "Mark's ruthless," Michael confirmed, "but we have the upper hand now. We know his plan, so we can counter it." Arthur nodded, gazing out the window. "First, I need to confront Gustav myself. I want him to tell me face to face." Michael arranged for Gustav to come the next day. The man arrived on edge, stepping into the study where Arthur waited by the fireplace. Arthur wasn't one to show anger, but at that moment his stare was intense. "Gustav," he began gravely, "you worked for me for years. I trusted you in my house, around my family. Now I find you not only betrayed me but also aided a man who wants to destroy me. What do you have to say?" Gustav hung his head, avoiding Arthur's gaze. "I'm sorry, sir, no excuses. I was desperate and didn't think about the consequences. Didn't think about consequences? Arthur demanded, stepping closer. You could have ruined not only my life but Helen's too. How do you justify that? I can't, Gustav answered in a trembling voice. But I'm ready to help now, to fix it. Arthur watched him in silence for endless seconds. Then he nodded once. Fine. But if you betray me again, there won't be anywhere to hide. Gustav swallowed, nodding vigorously. Understood, sir. With that, Arthur and Michael plotted a counteroffensive against Mark. It wouldn't be easy, but Arthur was determined to protect his family and rebuild his life, no matter how many hurdles. He'd never been so certain he could face whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, Claire was furious. Everything she'd spent years building was collapsing before her eyes, her comfortable life, her position as the wife of an influential man, and the financial security she worshipped. Since the day Arthur confronted her and ended their relationship, she'd tried to reclaim what she felt was hers, but to no avail. Arthur seemed more resolute than ever to forge a new life away from her, dedicated to Helen, a child Claire despised, now the center of it all. Frustration drove Claire to extreme measures. After weeks of brooding, she concluded her only move was to destroy Arthur's reputation. If she convinced the public he was cruel and incompetent, she might salvage some power over him. Gathering data, searching for any detail she could exploit, she leveraged her years of marriage, which gave her access to private documents, personal conversations, and details Arthur never expected her to remember. She reached out to a journalist famed for scandalous stories, offering an exclusive. She played the victim of a cold, negligent husband, a man who shirked family responsibilities for success and money. Though not entirely true, her mix of partial truths and lies sounded credible. Intrigued, the journalist began assembling the story, fed by Claire's documents and photos. But Claire didn't realize that Michael, ever vigilant since she tried to deny her link to Helen, had stayed on her trail. He suspected she wouldn't rest. He'd even arranged quiet surveillance in the places she frequented, enough to learn her plot in time to stop it. Michael told Arthur, who, though shocked at her manipulations, refused to let her ruin his fresh start. They set a defense plan. One night, as Claire was finalizing details with the journalist, her phone buzzed with an anonymous text. Attached was a file proving how she'd forged evidence to smear Arthur. The message was a warning: if she pursued her plan, her role in abandoning Helen and tricking the journalist would go public. Claire felt her world crumble. She'd misjudged both Arthur and Michael. She knew if everything came out, she'd lose any chance of regaining power or respect. But she wouldn't concede so easily. She confronted Arthur that same night, arriving at the mansion unannounced. He was in his study when he heard her furious footsteps. She burst in, face tight with rage and desperation. "How dare you meddle in my business?" she spat, shutting the door hard. Arthur stayed calm, arms folded. "Meddle? I'm protecting my life, Claire, something you'd destroy." "All I want is what I deserve," she shot back, voice rising. "You think you can rob me of everything and just walk away?" He stared at her in disbelief. "What are you talking about, Claire? You're the one who made these choices, who abandoned Helen, who lied behind my back. You have no right to accuse me." Claire's fists clenched. "Everything I did was for us, but now you pretend I'm the only villain. I won't let you erase me so easily." "You did that yourself," Arthur answered coldly. "Every action, every lie, brought you here. Now you want to spin the media to ruin me? It won't work. Michael exposed your plot, and if you keep pushing, every fact will come to light." Claire paused, anger flaring in her eyes. She was cornered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "So what will you do, Arthur? Live happily ever after with that child, like nothing happened? You have no idea what you're up against." Arthur stepped closer, voice low but certain. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, your actions, which I'm overcoming. You, on the other hand, keep sinking. Stop now, for your own sake and whatever remains of your dignity." They locked eyes. Finally, Claire left the study without another word. Arthur let her go, there was nothing more to say. In the following days, Michael confirmed that the journalist had dropped the story, fearing legal repercussions if Claire's manipulations surfaced. Her threat was neutralized, and Arthur could once again focus on his life with Helen, aware that although the challenges weren't over, he had won a crucial fight to safeguard their future. Arthur finally felt things were stabilizing. Helen was slowly adjusting, and despite the difficulties, every moment together felt like a victory. But that uneasy truce was broken one afternoon when Claire unexpectedly appeared at the mansion door. She looked different, exhausted eyes, a posture once proud and now wilted. Startled at the sight of her, Arthur didn't respond before she spoke. "We need to talk, Arthur," she said, voice tense. He kept the door half shut. "Claire, we've said it all. There's nothing left." She raised a hand, almost pleading. "Please. Just a few minutes. It's important." Arthur sighed, eventually opening the door enough for her to pass. He took her to the living room, both of them sitting, though he kept his distance. Tension radiated in the air. Claire spoke quickly, as if short on time. "I know I did something unforgivable. I won't defend it. But there are things you never understood." Arthur eyed her skeptically, arms folded. "What new excuse is this?" She swallowed, maintaining composure with difficulty. "Mark, he's been behind everything from the start. He manipulated me. He knew things about me, my family. Pressured me to make choices I didn't want. Marrying you, I thought I could escape him, but he always found ways to pull the strings." Arthur raised a brow, unconvinced. "And that includes abandoning my daughter? Lying to me for years? Did Mark force you?" Claire lowered her eyes, voice barely above a whisper. "No. That was me. But not out of cruelty, Arthur, I was scared. Mark convinced me if the child stayed, everything we had would collapse. He said you'd never forgive me if you knew. I believed him. I was so obsessed with protecting what we had that I did the unforgivable." He stayed silent, anger clear, but also doubt. "So now I'm supposed to think Mark orchestrated it all, and you were just his puppet?" Claire held his gaze, eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't want you to believe anything, I only need you to know the truth. I messed up, Arthur. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to tell you." Arthur stood, pacing to the window to gather his thoughts. Finally, he spoke without turning. "Claire, I might never grasp how you could do this. But I know I can't trust you now. Every word feels like more manipulation." Claire stood too, desperation creeping into her voice. "I'm not lying. I'm trying to fix what's left, though I know it's little. I lost everything, and it's my own fault, but I still care about you and Helen." He turned, face stony. "Helen doesn't need your sympathy, she needs stability, something you can't offer. If you actually care, stay away from us, so she can live without more lies or plots." Claire was silent, her shoulders sagging. "If that's what you want, I'll do it. But please, Arthur, look after her. Give her what I never could." Arthur said nothing more, just watching as she left. When she was gone, relief mingled with heaviness in his chest. He knew he'd done the right thing, but couldn't help wondering how much truth was in her words. That night, reading to Helen, he found himself thinking about all she'd endured. Claire was correct about one thing: what mattered now was Helen's well-being, and Arthur intended to safeguard the fragile peace they'd built. He still felt something amiss, some bigger plan. Michael felt it, too. After Claire's last visit, he dug into all the links among Mark, Gustav, and Claire. Days later, he arrived at the mansion carrying a thick folder. Arthur was in his study, scanning documents, when Michael entered without knocking, which was unlike him. "Arthur, you need to hear this," Michael said, setting the folder on the table, expression serious. Arthur set his own papers aside. "What is it?" "It's more than I thought," Michael replied, opening the folder to reveal numerous documents. "We've only seen the surface. This wasn't just Claire, or Mark capitalizing on her. It was orchestrated from the start, aiming to strip you of your fortune and legacy." Arthur stared, mind churning with anger and disbelief. "Explain yourself, Michael." "Claire, Mark, and Gustav were all involved, whether or not they knew every detail. Mark was the brains. He spotted your weaknesses early in your relationship, manipulated Claire. He saw Helen as your vulnerability, the perfect way to destabilize you later. Michael showed him transactions from one of Mark's companies to an overseas account in Claire's name. Mark had been funding her moves so she'd remain controlled. When Helen was born, Mark seized the chance to tighten his hold. He convinced Claire that keeping the girl away protected her status." Arthur pored over the pages, each line confirming Michael's words. The worst blow came when he learned the final piece: Gustav was the enforcer. Claire paid him to leave Helen, but she never realized Mark was also paying him, planning blackmail. Arthur clenched his fists. "Why now? Why wait?" "Mark waited for you to strengthen your businesses and investments," Michael explained. "When you started threatening his partner's interests, he saw his moment. Helen was the trump card, guaranteed to wreck your reputation and ruin you financially." Arthur paced the study. "This is insane. I thought it was a handful of personal failings, but it's a conspiracy." Michael nodded. "Yes. And now that we have the truth, we can fight back. We know who's involved, why, and can stop Mark's next move." Arthur stopped, face grim. "How do we do it without hurting Helen?" "I've planned that," Michael said. "We have enough proof to nail Mark, link Claire and Gustav to his scheme, and spare Helen. If we play it right, we'll use Mark's network against him, ensuring this story never sees the light." Arthur breathed deeply to steady himself. "Do whatever it takes, Michael. Just keep Helen safe. She won't pay for something she never asked for." Michael nodded and left, letting Arthur skim through the documents. That night, Arthur lay awake, consumed by the scale of betrayal. But more than anything, he felt driven to protect Helen. Over the next weeks, Michael's plan unfolded perfectly. He gathered more evidence, tapped important allies who could cripple Mark's web. Slowly, they closed in on Mark and his cronies. The final confrontation arrived. Arthur and Michael met Mark under the guise of business negotiations. Mark arrived as confident as ever, only to go pale when Michael spread incriminating files across the table. "Mark," Arthur began, voice dangerously calm, "we've sparred for years, but I didn't think you'd sink this low. Here is everything: your sabotage, ties to Claire and Gustav, your role in leaving Helen. Two choices: cooperate and vanish, or face charges and lose it all." Mark tried to bluff, but sweat covered his brow. Cornered, he finally asked, "What do you want? Drop any interference with my life or businesses. Cut ties with anyone connected to me. If you try anything, this goes to the police and the press." No other option, Mark left defeated. Arthur felt relief mixed with fatigue. He'd won the greatest battle of his life. Still, his true victory lay in protecting Helen. That night, he sat beside Helen in the mansion garden. Unaware of the showdown, she chatted about a new book she was reading. Arthur, listening, realized it was all worth it. The peace they had was hard-won, and he would preserve it, no matter what came. He'd noticed that in quiet moments, Helen gazed out windows as if expecting something that never came. It hurt him to think of her years without him, and he wanted to fully understand them. One afternoon in the garden, he broached it. Helen was under a tree, idly paging through a book. Arthur sat next to her. "Helen, I always wanted to ask," he began gently. "How was it for you, growing up away from here, with the people who took care of you?" Helen seemed surprised but didn't avert her eyes. She closed the book slowly, setting it aside. "It was different," she said carefully. "Not easy, but I had good people. Miss Lucy was there. If it wasn't for her, I don't know what I'd have done." Arthur nodded, encouraging. "What about the others? Anyone else help?" Helen paused as if recalling. "Some neighbors in the square weren't very kind, but others were. There was an older lady, Miss Clare, don't get her confused with, you know." She gave a tiny smile, and Arthur chuckled softly. "She gave me bread when she knew I hadn't eaten. And Mr. Matthew, the shoemaker, he hated that I was barefoot and gave me old sandals." Each story filled voids in Arthur's mind, helping him picture his fragile little daughter finding comfort from strangers he'd never know, in a community that raised her in dire conditions. "Did you ever want to find your mom?" Arthur asked quietly. Helen lowered her gaze, fiddling with grass. "When I was little, I did. But every time I asked Miss Lucy, she said my mom had problems and couldn't be with me. After a while, I stopped asking. Didn't want Miss Lucy thinking she wasn't enough." Arthur's throat tightened. Her loyalty to those who'd cared for her was incredible. "Helen, I wish I could change the past," he said. "But now that I'm here, I promise I'll do all I can so you won't ever lack anything. Not just the material stuff, but what matters. I want you to feel at home." She smiled a bit, and Arthur felt he was on the right track. As time passed, their talks became more natural. Helen recounted more about her early years, moments of hardship and the kindness of neighbors who offered small acts of charity. Each anecdote filled him with regret and pride. Helen's strength amazed him. Once, she mentioned the community that had welcomed her, listing names and small acts of help or protection. Moved, Arthur resolved to meet them and thank them personally for caring for his daughter when he hadn't been around. One afternoon, while they were in the square, Helen pointed to a particular bench and told him, "I used to sit there with Miss Clare. Sometimes she told me stories about her younger days." Arthur looked at her gently. "Want to introduce me?" Helen hesitated but, seeing his sincerity, agreed. "Sure." That was how Arthur met Miss Clare, an older woman with warm eyes, who had tried her best to provide food when Helen had no one. Her modest home and gentle smile testified to her good heart. Arthur thanked her through tears, and she simply replied, "She's always been a special girl. I had to help." Arthur realized that the small kindness of humble people had saved Helen's life. Deeply grateful, he contributed to that community, funding improvements for the square, providing supplies to neighbors in need, and vowing never to forget what they'd done for her. Helen, meanwhile, glowed with a new brightness. Seeing her father acknowledge the people who had helped her made her understand her past wasn't shameful, but proof of her resilience. One evening, on their walk home from the square, she stopped and looked at Arthur with shining eyes. "Dad, I'm still scared sometimes that all this will vanish." He crouched down. "It won't, Helen. We're together now, and I won't let anything separate us." She smiled with more confidence than before, and Arthur realized it was the greatest gift to hear those words. Over time, father and daughter grew closer. Painful memories lingered, but the future seemed full of hope. Helen spoke of her plans and dreams, and Arthur promised to do whatever it took to help her achieve them. Claire, in contrast, vanished from their daily life, never calling or reaching out. At times, Arthur pondered the shadows of her decisions, but he chose to focus on what mattered, his daughter, and the world they were rebuilding. Michael remained a steadfast ally, ensuring no new threat emerged. Whenever there was a hint Mark or anyone else might meddle, Arthur stood firm, protecting what he and Helen had forged. Eventually, Michael appeared at the mansion with an envelope. Opening it, Arthur and Helen saw legal documents confirming Mark had abandoned any claims or attempts at defamation. Everything was concluded, they were free from threats. Arthur felt a surge of relief and hugged Helen, who laughed through tears of joy. The nightmare was over. In time, Arthur decided on a new beginning. He sold many of his businesses, keeping only those he cared about, and created a foundation to help children in vulnerable situations, inspired by Helen. She became the face of it, sharing her story and proving hope survives even the darkest times. At a foundation event, Helen stood before an influential crowd, speaking with clarity and courage. She was no longer the frightened girl in the square, begging for help, but a determined young woman, inspiring others to believe in a better future. From the sidelines, Arthur watched with overflowing pride. Life had come full circle. Although he couldn't recover the years lost, he knew they'd built something far stronger, a bond that nothing could break. That night, after Helen's speech, they sat on the mansion's porch, gazing at the stars. She broke the silence. "Dad, do you think I'll ever understand why it all happened?" Arthur looked at her tenderly, answering simply, "Maybe not everything. Some things don't have reasons. But we can decide what to do with what we've lived through, and we decided to be together. That's what matters." Helen rested her head on his shoulder, smiling as a gentle breeze passed by. Both realized that, painful though the past was, it had led them to this moment, and the future stretched wide and bright, with the certainty that life can grant second chances when love and truth prevail.